I would like to introduce, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next plenary speaker today, Professor Steve Walsh from Newcastle. Steve has been a friend and colleague for a long time to me and to colleagues at the University of Limerick, and I'm delighted to welcome here today, and I'm really interested to hear what he has to say. Steve is Professor and Head of Applied Linguistics and Communication in the School of Education, Communication and Language Sciences in Newcastle. He's been involved in English language teaching for a very long number of years. He has a huge research profile, particularly in the area of classroom discourse, professional development and reflective practice, and he's going to share some of his thoughts and his insights from those areas with us today. And the title of his talk is Excellence in Teaching, a Possible Way Forward. Steve, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Fiona, and thanks again to the organisers for inviting me. I was beginning to feel a little bit like I was on Graham Norton's chat show there, and I think I was on that red chair that he flips back, the one I mean. So anyway, great to be here, good to see you all, and thanks for staying beyond lunch, which sometimes is the watershed, isn't it? So the title of this talk is Evidence in Teaching, a Possible Way Forward, ? The question mark is actually quite important because I'm not claiming to have all the answers here, and I think some of what I say is still, open to debate and discussion, which hopefully we'll get to in the breakout sessions later on. I've been involved in teacher education for a long time, both in this country, in Cork, at UCC, at Queen's, and before that overseas. So I've been looking at people, observing people teach and thinking about what makes effective teaching for quite a long time, and I've been writing about this for quite a while too. And what I'm trying to do at the minute is bring together sort of some of the thinking around reflective practice and some of my thinking around interaction and learning. That's what I'm trying to do in this talk. A lot of this work is work I've done with Steve Mann at Warwick University, and there is a book which will be out, this is the only book plug by the way, which will be out next year. It came out on Amazon before we'd even finished it, which was a bit hairy, and it's called Reflective Practice in English Language Teaching, Research-Based Problems and Principles. I'm not going to put a slide up of it, but you'll find it anyway, it's there. So what I'm saying today, a lot of it is based on some of that work. So this is what I want to try and cover. I may skip some of the slides because there's quite a lot here, but I think it's all going to be on the website. Am I right? Yeah. So you can catch up with anything I don't get through today. So when we think about reflection, there are lots of metaphors, lots of images of what reflection actually means. And if you translate it into other languages, it's quite an interesting word because often it equates with thinking. Just thinking. I think our definition, and I'm not going to get into semantics, is a little bit more than that. It's about thinking plus some kind of action. It's about evaluating yourself. It's often regarded as something that teachers do very much in training, on training courses like CELTAs and DELTAs and MA programs. And I've got data which shows that people are often very glad to finish with it, to get to the end of it and not do it anymore, which is kind of sad. And we're trying to make a bit of a pitch for changing that. You've got this kind of image of the thinker. This one, I think this is Icarus, is it? Icarus, is that the right pronunciation? Reflecting back what you see, and I think that's an element of it as well. If we look at what's going on in teacher education at the moment, I think we can say a number of trends that are emerging. Teacher autonomy and self-development is one of those trends. And there's a definite need that, for teachers to acquire skills and practices which will allow them to develop themselves, I think, in an autonomous way. So the idea of everything going through some kind of CPD program is certainly one aspect of teacher education, but I'd rather think, what can we do to help teachers do it for themselves? So when we think about teacher efficacy and effectiveness, I think it's really important to think how can we use reflective practice to help develop closer understandings of context. Context is a key word in this talk, and when I say context, I'm not just talking about the place, the physical location, the types of learners. I'm talking about the moment-by-moment creation of context which takes place as people interact in classrooms. Leo van Leer calls this ecological. He compares it to the natural world when, it's like when you throw a stone in a pond, you have that ripple effect. If you touch one thing, it has a knock-on effect somewhere else. And I think the same is true of classrooms. If you change one classroom practice, it almost always affects something else in that context. So context is key to this. Reflective practice as a construct has been around, I think, since it was 1933 with Dewey. It goes back a long way. And I think most people in this room would probably agree that it has achieved now a status of orthodoxy. It's something that we all inherently feel is a good thing. It's something that we feel will help professional practice and so on. But at the same time, when you start looking at models of reflective practice, you find they're a little bit flabby, a little bit under-supported with data or evidence. So we haven't got much in the way of evidence or data to show how reflection gets done, to show people doing reflection, which has implications both for research and teacher development. It's often described in rather vague, elusive ways. So I'm being a little bit critical here, but I'm also still very much want to say that, we're Steve Mine and I, who've done this work, we're actually very much supportive of it. There's also, when you look at what goes on in teacher education programs, very heavy dependence on written forms of reflection. My two daughters have both recently taken the CELTA, and their reflections were entirely based on written pro formas. What I think they now refer to as, is it hot and cold reflection? So hot reflection is immediately after you've done some teaching, and then cool reflection is a little bit later at a slight distance. But it's all written. There's very little dialogue involved in any of these forms of reflection. And the other sort of criticism, if you like, is that there's no real way in which reflective practice has been operationalized, in other words, put into practice in any systematic way. It's been done in a rather ad hoc way. So this is the starting point for what I want to say in the rest of this first part of the talk. So just to recap, we need data, we need evidence. I think it would be often better as a collaborative process rather than an individual one. And it should be probably more dialogic than written. And the other key issue, of course, is that most forms of reflection on formal teacher education programs are assessed. They are part of the assessment process. And that's problematic. That has all kinds of issues. I mean, there's a nice paper by somebody called Valerie Hobbs, 2007, and she calls it faking it. Trainee teachers fake it. They don't tell you what they really feel. They tell you what they think you want to hear. And that varies from one tutor to another, right? So we don't really find out what's going on in terms of people's real reflections. And then there's the whole nature of reflective tools. What kinds of tools can we use, should we be using in order to promote reflection? So in terms of how reflection gets done, we're saying that, I skipped that. We're saying that it should be, have these elements to it. It should be data-led and evidence-based. And I'll talk about what I mean by data in a minute. We're proposing that it should be dialogic and collaborative rather than individual and written. And it should use appropriate tools. And of course, tools are things which fit the context. So what works in one context might not be appropriate in another. These tools also need to vary over time. I don't know how many people here are involved in CELTA, Delta, Trinity, or Irish equivalents of those kinds of teacher education courses, but the standard pro forma that's used on many teacher education courses is often the same right through the course. And of course, you need to vary the kind of task that you get people to reflect on from week 1 to, say, week 4 or whatever it is. So we need to look at that as well. So data, I mean, what I mean by data is basically anything which helps you understand teaching and learning. So it could be a video recording of a lesson. It could be a conversation with a colleague, a piece of material, a test score, 2 students talking together. All these things give us insights into what's going on in the classroom. But instead of, you know, the typical sort of comment that you actually hear from people after they've done some teaching about whether it went well or not so well, we need to get away from that a little bit and start off by describing what happened. And to describe what happened, we need something to base that description on. I've written here big R versus small r. I'm talking about individual, small-scale, action research type data, not big R as in published research. But I think the whole notion of data is something we could do a lot to promote in terms of encouraging reflection. And I've already mentioned Van Leer's ideas around ecological reflection. So this is a little bit of data. Just have a read of that. So what we have here are 2 teacher trainers actually talking about how to do feedback after a piece of teaching. And what they're saying is that we need to integrate this PebblePad, which is a software program, more thoroughly, and actually integrate that into the post-lesson discussions. So we get how could we integrate the software to encourage a more focused observation rather than doing general observation. How can we make it more specific? How can we make it more precise? And I think the use of transcripts like this are a very important way of promoting understandings of practice, whether it's teacher education or teaching in the classroom. One of my colleagues at the University of Durham, Teti Dragas, is using a lot of what she calls structured reflection in her MA program. So she teaches an MA, quite like the one at Limerick, which I'm familiar with, where they do a teaching practice element. They have a practical teaching component. And the very first piece of reflection that they do is to compare the context that they're teaching in Durham with their own context back home. And I mean, this is a very simple thing, but these questions, I think, are extremely useful in terms of raising awareness of what do we mean by context, how do people's roles vary from one context to another, and how do you need to change your practice depending on where you're teaching and who you're teaching. These are initial early career teachers on this MA program in Durham. Very simple questions, but it gives the reflective process a little bit of a structure, which I think is quite important. So that was the idea of data. The second point I made was it needs to be dialogic. Now, when you see the word dialogic, to me, it makes me think of sociocultural theory. You know, the idea of people like Vygotsky, Neil Mercer, Robin Alexander, Jim Lantolf, people like that, who use sociocultural theory. And what's important here is that meanings, when we're trying to create new understandings of anything, they don't just happen. They are jointly created. They are co-constructed. So the give and take that takes place in any sort of dialogue is an important way of establishing meaning. In this morning's plenary, Samuel was mentioning the importance of opportunity in learning. And under sociocultural theory, these are called affordances. Affordances are opportunities, moments where learning might occur, learning where development might occur. And I think these kinds of things are often applied to classroom teaching, but they're also very important in teacher education. You know, the ways in which teachers make sense of what's going on in their classrooms doesn't arise just by question and answer. It arises through joint negotiation of meaning and co-construction. Another point which Samuel made this morning was the need to take ownership of things, right? So we all learn in different ways. We all gain new understandings very differently. And I'm pretty sure if I had the time to talk to each of you after this session, you would all have very different takes on what I was talking about, you know? You might say you should have stayed on that Graham Norton show and he would have flipped you back on that chair, you know. But appropriation is ownership. So how do we appropriate new knowledge? How do we gain ownership? And then there's the whole point of exploratory talk, which I'll skip for now. But here's an example of two teachers talking about their use of language in the classroom. Just to save time, I'll try and summarize what I think is going on here. They became, this was a study I did some years ago, they became very obsessive about their habits of communication. And one of the things they really got into was teacher echo. You know, teacher echo. You know what I'm talking about when I say teacher echo, this constant need to repeat ourselves, which we do, all of us do this, almost as a habit, right? It's almost something we do instinctively, often to fill a silence, for example, right? And one of these teachers called it her bête noire. You know, this was a thing she was really fighting with as she went through this program. But what they say in this little extract here is that, sorry, can you see the question here? What effect did that have by teacher two, right? So she asked this kind of probing question. And we get this light bulb moment. I call this a light bulb moment when we have the chance to actually voice what we think is the consequence of this. And she says, you know, it makes them more confident. If you don't repeat everything, they become more confident. They have to listen the first time. And with more advanced learners, this is important. You could argue, and I'm not sure whether this holds completely, but it might be that without this dialogue, without this probing, this realization may never have happened. It's the chance to voice new ideas, to get a second opinion, and to get more insights into what's really going on. So this is the true value of a dialogic approach to RP. Here's Mike Chick. By the way, these people like Mike Chick and Teti Dragas are all people who've sent us snippets of reflection for our work, Steve Mann and I's book. So this was Mike Chick, who's based in the University of Glamorgan in Gloucestershire in England. And he uses this to show co-construction. This is two trainee teachers on a CELTA program, and they're trying to find a way of presenting personal adjectives describing people's character, like arrogant, selfish, and so on. So they're trying to come up with a context. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of give and take in this, of these trainee teachers trying to work out how can we create something a bit more interesting than your standard gap fill exercise. And eventually we get to the last bit where learner teacher 1 says, what about using flashcards and getting them to work out together which one goes where or something. But you see what I mean about this co-construction. That idea didn't just happen. There was a process to get there, and they went through that together. So there is value in this idea of co-construction. The third thing I mentioned was the need for appropriate tools. And there's been work done on this by John Gray and David Block, who are very critical of what they call McDonaldized teacher education. It's a bit like, are you familiar with Scott Thornberry's work on grammar McNuggets? You know this thing I'm talking about, where we're often sort of, are there any publishers in the room? I better be careful what I say here. Basically, the way course books are organized is often not about pedagogy or learning. It's down to what the publishers want and the organization and so on, right? And they're making the same observation of teacher education. It can become McDonaldized. In other words, we all do it in the same way. You know, the CELTA program, the Delta program, formal programs of teacher education follow almost a sort of sterile kind of approach rather than being more creative, again, going back to your talk this morning. So I think what we can do to get away from that is think about appropriate tools to help people understand their practice. And I want to mention a few things here. I think video is the future for teacher education, without doubt. I think most teacher education, formal, informal, pre-service, in-service, is likely to make very heavy use of video because video is everywhere now. We can make videos in the blink of an eye. They are very revealing. They tell us what's going on. Lots of reasons for doing that. Stimulated recall, I'll show you an example of how that works in a minute. At Newcastle, my colleagues John Haynes and Paul Miller have developed an app which is called VIO, Video Enhanced Observation. I'll show you that in a minute, which allows you to tag what's going on in a piece of teaching. So you can tag everything that goes on either as you observe it or later. And the good thing about this app is that you can find all the examples of any particular feature that you want to. So if you want to look at all the display questions or all the error corrections or all the elicitations, you can literally skip from one example to the next in a piece of teaching, which is absolutely fantastic when you're doing feedback with trainee teachers and so on. You can just say, okay, we're just going to look at your error correction. You find every example of error correction in their teaching and you just play that bit. You don't have to watch the whole thing. So it's got great applications, this. And of course, online blogs, communities of practice, work by Brona Murphy in Edinburgh. She's done some work on this. She finds that student teachers feel safe in an online environment when they're talking about their professional practice, right? They feel more comfortable doing it like that than in face-to-face encounters. And I can see that. So the whole thing about communities and online blogs and so on is, again, something to think about in the future. So video, I think we all see the value of video. We can make a number of observations. It allows us to really focus on concrete detail. I think we're all pretty bad, well, I'm certainly very bad, at recalling exactly what happened when I teach. But if you've got the video there as evidence, you know, cameras don't lie, do they? They show you everything, warts and all, and allow us to look at things in more detail. They allow us to create sensitivities around things like communication in the classroom, how much teacher talk there is, what kind of involvement was there by learners, right? And they allow you to see things that you wouldn't see otherwise. Paula Golombek, 2011, she uses this socio-cultural idea of mediation. It's a mediational tool. It allows us to develop close understandings. And I think one nice thing about video with early career teachers and novice teachers is it actually gives them a bigger voice. It allows you to say more. You know, there's a whole meta-language about describing what goes on in classrooms that novice teachers don't have. But the video really helps. It acts as a kind of support. So here we have a trainee teacher. Just have a quick read through this. It's in two parts. Now this teacher's obviously got plenty of time on her hands to be able to do calculations like this. 1.28 seconds, but just read the next part. And there we have, you know, the last two lines there, this realization, this, if you like, this light bulb moment. It's not just about rephrasing questions. It's about interruption. How often do we interrupt students? And the video showed that quite clearly. She hadn't realized that, but the video gave that quite clearly. I think one of the best ways of using video, and I've used this a lot in my work, both for teacher education and research, is something called stimulated recall. I haven't got a reference on here, but if you want a reference, I think the best one is a guy called Lyle, L-Y-L-E, Lyle, and it's about 2003, where they do a survey of uses of stimulated recall. This is video replay plus discussion, right? So you make a short recording, you replay it, and you talk about it. And it's actually a very powerful way of raising awareness about particular features. It can be used just as a springboard, as a stimulus, as a talking point for discussing lots of different things. And it's actually, it works quite well with peer-peer observation. You know, it doesn't have to involve a trainer or anything like that. It can be two teachers working together. So here's an example from my data. So on the left, we have the classroom interaction, and on the right, we have the teacher's commentary. Yeah, there's quite a lot on these slides. I'm kind of rushing you a little bit. I think you get the idea, though, that we have this word discographics, which, as far as I know, doesn't exist. And she was going to kind of interrupt and say, what do you mean? But she sort of let it go in her own commentary. I was going to say it's a false friend, but I decided not to. I thought that might confuse her. So I think it's a really nice way of seeing what happened in the interaction and then looking at people's comments on it. You don't actually need the transcript. I need the transcript in a presentation like this, but you don't have to transcribe it. I'm a great believer in getting away from transcription. Teachers haven't got time to do transcription, but we need to understand what's going on, right? So the way we do that is we use what I'm calling snapshot recordings. So snapshot recordings are 10, 12 minutes, that's all, and we replay them with no transcript. They give you all kinds of insights into what's going on and allow this kind of commentary. And of course, if there's two of you watching it, you get a question and answer sort of probing going on as well. Now, at Newcastle, I just mentioned to you this app, which has been developed. It's freely available, but move fast. Because it's not going to be available free for very long. They're going to start charging for this soon. Video enhanced observation. It allows you to, as I've said, record, tag, and replay what's going on and actually get a proper sense of a teacher's performance. It actually gives you a statistical profile of all the features that you've tagged. So it will tell you things like 28% of your time was spent asking display questions. 4% of your time was on repair. Really useful as a training tool. And we're actually developing it in another project, which I'll tell you about at the end. Okay, that's VO. Okay, how are we doing? Are we all right for time? Yes. Yes, okay. So, what I've just talked to you about was some ideas about how we might do reflective practice, how we might improve methodologies for doing reflective practice, how we might make it more evidence-based, dialogic, and using appropriate tools. The what is more tricky, which is why I've left it till the end. It's what are we reflecting on? And if we remind ourselves what reflective practice is about, it's about trying to understand teaching and learning more fully, and it's about helping teachers do their job better, but it also must have some connection to learning. Because what we're about as teachers is helping people learn and facilitating learning. So I'd like to make a pitch today for looking at learning as something that we do rather than something that we have. In other words, if we want to understand what's going on in terms of learning, we need to look at what people are doing and saying. We need to look at their actions. We need to look at interaction, in short. And a number of people have kind of support this idea that if we want to understand learning, the starting place is interaction. We can't see what's going on in people's heads. We can understand what people are saying, what people are doing, which gives us feedback on what we think they're learning. So interaction, to me, lies at the heart of reflective practice. In other words, if we want to give people something to reflect on, let's start with interaction. And there are a number of ways of viewing this. Again, I'm using sociocultural theory here. Learning is largely a social process. I'm not denying there's a cognitive dimension, of course there is, but a lot of what we see, what we observe as teachers, is a social process. It's mediated by language. It's influenced by language. It's very hard to separate anything that we've ever learnt in our lives from the language we used to learn it. So that's an important element. It often involves some kind of co-construction, which we've seen. It involves scaffolding through, I don't want to get into all the theory too much, but the zone of proximal development. This is the sort of how much would you learn by working on your own versus how much would you learn by working with somebody more experienced, more qualified, or who knows more than you. That's the indicator there. I think we can say that participation, although we can't equate it with learning, it's certainly an indicator of learning. And of course, participation can be broken down into lots of other elements like engagement, involvement, and so on. And these are kinds of things we like to see when we're teaching. And I think there are two key elements here. Again, I'm very happy to hear that Samuel mentioned them this morning. The worst thing about coming later in the day is to contradict or oppose something that's gone on earlier, but I think you did mention opportunity and you did mention ownership. These are two key elements of how learning can be influenced. So what I've been working on is something called classroom interactional competence. This is something a construct I developed some years ago, about 2011, and it's based on earlier work on interactional competence by people like Claire Cramsh, who was the originator of the notion of interactional competence. And she said, I think this is a very important quote, I propose a push for interactional competence to give our students a truly, key word now, emancipating education rather than a compensating one. And I think what she's saying here is we should look at what students can do rather than what they can't do. And a lot of work in assessment, I used to be an IELTS examiner, so I'm familiar with quite a few of the kind of ways in which IELTS descriptors are made up. A lot of what we use is describing learners to native speakers. And instead of doing that, we should be saying, well, what can they do, actually? And in fact, when you look at interactional competence, most learners are incredibly adept at using all kinds of skills and strategies to create meaning and to make themselves understood. My former colleague, Vivian Cook, calls the former a deficit model of learning, a deficit model where we're comparing students with what they can't do rather than saying what they can do, okay? So I think that's a really important quote. More recent quotes here by Newman Marquis. Richard Young talks about this, and we've been working with Cambridge, and people in this room like Anne O'Keefe here has been involved very heavily in English Profile. And this is a project run by Cambridge ESOL, University of Cambridge, and CUP. I think that's right, is it, Anya? And they are looking at the Common European Framework of Reference in relation to what these descriptors say and comparing that to actual practice in classrooms. So these descriptors came about through the work of John Trim many years ago, and the project that's currently underway, I think it's still going on, am I right? Still going, yeah. Is basically saying, let's check these descriptors. Do they really work? Let's see what goes on in classrooms. Let's see what goes on in tests. And maybe we need to make some adjustments. Newcastle got involved in this project, and we've collected a million words of small group teaching data in the university. And we're looking at something around the theme of interactional competence. And the prediction is that in the future, it's very likely that instead of talking about 4 skills in language testing circles, we'll be talking about 5. The 5th one will be interactional competence. And there's been work done on that to suggest that may happen. So there's good reasons for looking at it and saying, what does it mean and how does it change from one context to another? Joan Kelly Hall and colleagues in America, this book, 2011, really nice book, case studies around the world. What do students in different countries do to demonstrate interactional competence? What does it look like? Okay? So that's another one to consider. This is my own definition of classroom interactional competence. Teachers and learners' ability to use interaction as a tool for mediating and assisting learning. Again, you can see the socio-cultural influence here. And I think there's a few other things which are relevant to this. Very nice paper by somebody called Svard, 98, where she talked about learning as doing rather than learning as having, right? And it's really trying to get at this complex relationship between language, interaction and learning. It's still only partially understood. We still don't really fully understand how those things work together. So there's a lot to do in this area. But what I'm interested in here, and what I'm interested in currently, is how can we reflect on our practice through the lens of classroom interactional competence? How can it help us understand our teaching better when the focus is classroom interactional competence? So here's a little bit of data. This is taken from a university in the north of Ireland. There are only two, so I'll leave it up to you to guess which one it is. This is a pre-sessional English language course, and it's one of those classic EFL tasks where students bring photographs along and they have to, introduce friends and family to one another. Just have a quick read through that. I think this is a really nice extract for lots of reasons, and normally I would get you to look at this in groups and talk about it and come up with your ideas about what interactional competence is in this particular piece of data. We haven't got time to do that, but I think immediately you can see one or two things here where they're managing the turn-taking very nicely. I mean, I've done the analysis for you here. There's plenty of flow, isn't there? There's not much breakdown. It's well managed. These are not very advanced learners. They're probably sort of intermediate plus, but not much more than that. Even though errors occur, they're largely ignored. My colleague Alan Firth at Newcastle calls this the let it pass principle. If errors don't get in the way, ignore them. Right? Let it pass. And that's often used in business settings where English is used as a lingua franca. There are overlaps, there are interruptions, and these often indicate what Mike McCarthy calls listenership, the fact that we're paying attention to each other, we're giving feedback, we're giving back channels, acknowledgement tokens, and so on. I think the topic is also well managed in testing circles. Topic management is an indicator of coherence. So the fact that it's coherent is because topics are well managed. And there's lots of empathy. There's lots of evidence of students helping each other. So we can make some initial claims here. From a lot more data, this is kind of jumping ahead now, but based on all the work I've done on this so far, I think we can say that the first thing is that contexts are co-constructed. They are jointly created. I haven't got time to talk about modes right now. That pedagogic goals and language use have to work together, they're convergent, that we use strategies which are appropriate to the moment and which help co-construct meanings. And I think there are two other features here which are really important. This idea of space. How do we create space for learning? Not physical space, but space in the discourse. How do teachers create that kind of space? We've seen some examples of this reduced echo, increased wait time, lack of interruptions and so on. That's one thing. And another one is, how do teachers shape learner contributions? How do we take a contribution from a learner and do something with it which helps them, rather than just correct it? And I think this is a real skill and possibly one of the hallmarks of really effective teaching. I'm going to skip the next one, actually. I'm just going to jump through that. And I'm going to skip that. I'm running out of time. I want to show you a little clip. And I've only chosen this clip, really. I normally show 2 or 3 clips, but we're really pushed for time today. I've chosen this because it's very high quality. It's studio quality production. This is in China. It's an EFL class, and the focus is talking about museums, right? And in fact, this data is taken from something which happens in China quite a bit, where they have teaching competitions. It's like the X Factor for teachers, right? So we've got 3 teachers. I'm only going to show you one. And at the end of they all teach the same class, and they all teach the same topic. And at the end of it, a panel of judges will decide the winner, okay? So let's have a look.
Actually, there is a successful example. The biggest museum in Canada. The director has got good ideas and succeeded in attracting more children to his museum. Wow, what ideas do you think the director has? Zhang Shenzhen?
I think maybe he let some students like us and to introduce some knowledge to the children.
Okay.
So the children is easy to get the knowledge.
Okay, so somebody to teach, to teach children, right? How about you, Li Shan?
Okay. So, very short clip. I mean, normally we'd have more time, but it serves a purpose in the way this teacher did allow some space. She did allow time for students to make contribution. I would say those contributions, the one we saw there was pretty good actually in terms of time, in terms of length. Most contributions in classrooms around the world I've seen are usually 1 or 2 words maximum. There is a lack of corrective feedback, this idea of let it pass, and an elaborated response, and seeking clarification when not satisfied. This idea of not accepting the first thing that we see all the time, or that we hear, but actually going back and saying, what do you mean by that? You know, this idea of the give and take in the interaction is key to this. Okay, so where's this taking us? Well, I think there's a lot more work to be done on this idea of classroom interactional competence. And I must emphasize that this is extremely context specific. It varies hugely from one place to another, from levels of learners, from whether it's EFL, ESL, EAL, or whatever, and also from what the pedagogic goals of the moment actually are. I think there is work to be done on using this as a focus. I've seen the construct used on CELTA programs quite successfully. You know, when you first start teaching, what do I reflect on? Well, let's just see what's going on in terms of the interaction that's taking place as a way of understanding the learning. I think we need a lot more collaboration with teachers. This has to be a key enterprise, a joint enterprise, research with teachers, by teachers, rather than research done to teachers, which is very often the case, unfortunately. I think we need to try and aim for thick descriptions, so more detailed. We've experimented a little bit. Anne again and I have done stuff on using corpus linguistics with conversation analysis, for example. 2 very different methodologies, give you very different views of the data. And something which I've been going on about for more than 7 or 8 years, more than that, more than 10 years actually, is this idea that teacher education would benefit from what I'm calling a 3rd strand, which is all around interactional competence. We have a strand which is about subject knowledge, a strand which is methodology. I think it would be really useful to have something just focusing on interaction. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you. Thanks.